Have you ever felt like your life has stopped moving? You pray, but nothing changes. You work hard, but the breakthrough never comes. You keep believing, yet every new day looks exactly like the one before it. And after a while, a dangerous thought begins to whisper inside your mind. Maybe I missed God's plan. Maybe He forgot about me. Maybe my purpose was meant for someone else. But what if the greatest mistake you could make is believing that because you can't see God moving, He isn't? Because one of the most powerful stories in the Bible begins with a young man who received a promise from God and then watched his entire life fall apart. His name was Joseph. God gave him dreams that pointed to an incredible future. Dreams so clear that there was no doubt they came from God. Everything suggested that Joseph's life was about to move forward, but it didn't. Instead of promotion, he experienced betrayal. Instead of honor, he was thrown into a pit. Instead of freedom, he became a slave. Instead of justice, he was sent to prison for a crime he never committed. If you had met Joseph during any of those moments, you probably would have said the same thing many people say today. His life is over. But that's exactly where most people misunderstand how God works. Because God doesn't stop working just because your life looks stuck. In fact, some of His greatest work happens when nothing seems to be happening at all. Here's the part of Joseph's story that most people miss. His brothers thought they were destroying his future. Potiphar's wife thought she was ruining his life. The prison forgot his name. Everyone believed they were writing the end of Joseph's story. None of them realized they were unknowingly building the exact road that would lead him to his destiny. And maybe that's exactly what's happening in your life right now. The disappointment you never wanted, the opportunity you lost, the door that suddenly closed, the betrayal you still don't understand. What if none of those things stopped God's plan? What if they became part of it? Before we continue, there's one truth you need to hold on to. Being stuck is not the same as being abandoned. Sometimes God appears silent because He is preparing something bigger than what you can currently see. And Joseph's journey proves that in a way almost no other story in Scripture does, because every setback looked like failure, until it became the next step toward the palace. Joseph was only 17 years old when God gave him those dreams. He didn't ask for greatness, he didn't invent those visions. God placed them in his heart. Joseph simply believed what God had shown him. And that's something we often overlook. God gave Joseph the promise, but He never told him how painful the journey would be. Maybe that's where you are today. You know God has placed something inside your heart, a calling, a purpose, a promise. But the road you're walking looks nothing like the destination you expected. Instead of open doors, you find rejection. Instead of progress, you face delay. Instead of answers, you hear silence. And that's exactly where discouragement begins to grow. Because we naturally assume that if God is leading us, life should become easier. But Scripture tells a completely different story. Joseph's first obstacle wasn't strangers, it was his own family. His brothers hated him, not because he had done something wrong, but because of what God intended to do through him. Jealousy turned into anger. Anger became hatred. Hatred became a plan. One day they grabbed Joseph, tore off his robe, threw him into a pit, and sold him as a slave. Imagine that moment. The young man carrying God's promise is now chained behind a caravan, leaving everything he has ever known. If you stopped the story there, it would look like evil had won. It would look like the dream had died before it even began. But this is where we have to see the story from heaven's perspective instead of Joseph's. His brothers believed they were removing him from his future. In reality, they were transporting him toward it. Because the palace God had prepared for Joseph was never in Canaan. It was in Egypt. Without betrayal, there is no Egypt. Without Egypt, there is no palace. Without the pit, there is no purpose fulfilled. Think about that for a moment. The greatest act of betrayal in Joseph's life became the first step toward the greatest blessing God had prepared for him. That's how God works. People make decisions out of envy. out of pride, out of hatred, out of selfishness. They are responsible for those choices. But none of those choices are greater than God's sovereignty. The people who tried to stop Joseph's destiny actually carried it forward without realizing it. And maybe you've spent years asking, why did this happen to me? What if the better question is, what was God building through what happened to me? Because sometimes the event you call the end, God calls the beginning, and Joseph was about to discover that the pit was never his destination. It was only the road that led to the next chapter. Joseph arrived in Egypt with nothing. No family, no money, no freedom. Only a promise that now seemed impossible. If someone had looked at his life from the outside, they probably would have said God's plan failed. But they would have been completely wrong, because God's work is often invisible before it becomes undeniable. Joseph was bought by Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials. He wasn't living his dream. He was serving someone else's. Day after day, year after year. No applause, no recognition. No sign that the dreams God had given him were getting any closer. Have you ever felt like that? You know God called you. You know He placed something inside your heart. Yet your days are filled with ordinary routines that seem to have nothing to do with your purpose. That's one of the hardest seasons of faith. Not suffering, waiting. Because suffering at least gives you a reason. Waiting often gives you silence. But Joseph made a decision that changed everything. He refused to become bitter. He chose faithfulness before promotion. While many people spend their lives asking God for bigger opportunities, Joseph honored God in the opportunity he already had. He worked with excellence. He served with integrity. He remained faithful when nobody was watching. And little by little, God caused everything under Joseph's care to prosper. Notice something important. Joseph still wasn't free. His circumstances hadn't changed. But God's favor had never left him. Sometimes we measure God's presence by our comfort. Joseph measured God's presence by God's faithfulness. Then, just when it finally looked like life was improving, everything collapsed again. Potiphar's wife tried to seduce him. Joseph refused. He chose obedience instead of compromise. And obedience cost him everything. She lied. He was falsely accused, without a trial, without a chance to defend himself. Joseph was thrown into prison. Can you imagine the thoughts that must have filled his mind? I honored God. I did the right thing, so why am I here? Maybe you've asked that same question. I tried to live honestly. I forgave. I stayed faithful. So why does it feel like everyone else moves forward while I'm stuck? The world teaches that doing the right thing always brings immediate rewards. The Bible teaches something deeper. Sometimes doing the right thing places you exactly where God needs you next. Because Joseph's prison wasn't proof that God had abandoned him. It was preparation for the greatest appointment of his life. If Potiphar had believed Joseph, he would have stayed in the house. If he had stayed in the house, he never would have entered the prison. And if he had never entered the prison, he never would have met the two men whose dreams would eventually bring him before Pharaoh. Do you see the pattern? The false accusation wasn't the interruption, it was the connection. The prison wasn't the delay, it was the bridge. What looked like another devastating setback was quietly becoming another piece of God's perfect plan. Once again, evil believed it had closed Joseph's future, but without knowing it, it opened the next door God had already prepared. The prison was nothing like Joseph imagined. Cold walls, locked doors. Another place where his dreams seemed farther away than ever before. Think about how easy it would have been to give up. He had already been betrayed, already been enslaved, already been falsely accused. Now he was forgotten behind bars. If anyone had a reason to believe life was unfair, it was Joseph. Yet something extraordinary happened. The prison changed Joseph far less than Joseph changed the prison. Even there he remained faithful. Even there he worked with excellence. Even there God was with him. That's one of the greatest lessons in this story. Your location cannot limit God's presence. A prison doesn't stop God. A setback doesn't stop God. A closed door doesn't stop God. Sometimes the only thing that stops us is believing the lie that God has stopped too. Then one day, 2 new prisoners arrived, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. To everyone else, they were just 2 more inmates. To God, they were the next pieces of the plan. They both had disturbing dreams. No one could explain them, but Joseph could, not because he was gifted, because God was still speaking through him, even inside a prison. Joseph interpreted both dreams. One would be restored, the other would die, exactly as God revealed. Before the cupbearer returned to Pharaoh's palace, Joseph asked for one simple favor. Please remember me. Imagine the hope in those words. For the first time in years, it looked like the door was finally opening. Finally, someone would tell Pharaoh about the innocent Hebrew sitting in prison. Finally, justice would come. Finally, his waiting would end. But it didn't. The cupbearer walked out of prison, returned to his position, and completely forgot Joseph. Not for a week, not for a month, for 2 more years. 2 years. Imagine waking up every morning expecting someone to come, hearing footsteps in the hallway, wondering if today would finally be the day, and every evening realizing nothing had changed. This is where most people lose hope, not because of tragedy, but because of silence, because nothing seems to happen. But here's the incredible part. If the cupbearer had remembered Joseph immediately, Joseph would have been released at the wrong time. He might have become just another free man in Egypt. Instead, God allowed 2 more years to pass because heaven's timing was more important than Joseph's comfort. Those weren't wasted years. They were perfectly timed years. Then, on the exact day God had already ordained, Pharaoh had 2 dreams that no one in all of Egypt could explain. Suddenly, the cupbearer's memory returned, not by accident, not by coincidence, at exactly the right moment. Only then did he remember Joseph. Do you see it? The forgotten season wasn't forgotten by God. The delay wasn't abandonment. It was divine timing. The silence wasn't empty. God was arranging a meeting that would change not only Joseph's life, but the future of an entire nation. Sometimes the greatest evidence that God is working is that he refuses to let things happen before the right time. Everything changed in a single morning. Not because Joseph forced the door open, not because he finally convinced the right people, not because he fought harder than everyone else. Everything changed because the moment God had prepared finally arrived. Pharaoh couldn't sleep. 2 dreams disturbed him so deeply that the most powerful man in the world became desperate for answers. Every wise man failed. Every magician failed. Every advisor failed. And suddenly, the forgotten prisoner became the only person in Egypt who had the answer. Think about how incredible that is. For years, Joseph probably wondered why God wasn't doing anything. He couldn't see what was happening beyond the prison walls. He didn't know Pharaoh would have those dreams. He didn't know Egypt was approaching 7 years of abundance followed by 7 years of famine. He didn't know an entire nation would soon need someone with God's wisdom. God knew. While Joseph thought heaven was silent, heaven was preparing history. Isn't that exactly what happens to us? We judge our lives by the chapter we're living. God writes the entire story. We panic because we can't see tomorrow. God is already standing there. We think we're waiting on God. Many times, God is waiting for the exact moment when everything he has prepared comes together. Joseph stood before Pharaoh, not wearing royal clothes, not carrying a title, not surrounded by influence, just a former prisoner who trusted God. Pharaoh explained the dreams. Joseph listened. Then he said something remarkable. I cannot do it, but God will give Pharaoh the answer. Even after everything he had suffered, Joseph wasn't bitter. He wasn't arrogant. He wasn't trying to prove himself. His confidence wasn't in his talent. It was in God's faithfulness. Joseph interpreted the dreams. 7 years of abundance, 7 years of famine. Then he went one step further. He presented a plan to save Egypt before the disaster arrived. That wisdom didn't just impress Pharaoh. It revealed that God had been preparing Joseph long before anyone noticed him. And in one extraordinary moment, everything that looked impossible suddenly made sense. The pit, the slavery, the false accusation, the prison, the forgotten years. None of them had been random. Every painful chapter had placed Joseph exactly where he needed to be when the opportunity arrived. Then Pharaoh said words Joseph could never have imagined hearing. "You shall be in charge of my palace." In a single day, the prisoner became the governor of Egypt. The forgotten man became the second most powerful leader in the nation. The dream that seemed impossible suddenly became reality. But don't miss the greatest miracle. The miracle wasn't that Joseph reached the palace. The miracle was that God used every act of evil to carry him there. The betrayal carried him. The slavery carried him. The prison carried him. Even being forgotten carried him. Everything the enemy intended to stop, God transformed into another step toward his purpose. And maybe that's what you need to hear today. You keep looking at the pit. God is looking at the palace. You keep looking at the delay. God is looking at the perfect timing. You keep asking why your life feels stuck. God may be building something so much bigger than you can imagine that one day you'll look back and realize none of it was wasted. Not one tear, not one closed door, not one lonely season, not one painful chapter. But Joseph's story doesn't end in the palace, because reaching the destination wasn't God's greatest objective. Transforming Joseph's heart was. Years later, the famine arrived exactly as God had revealed. People came from every direction looking for food. Among them, the very brothers who had thrown Joseph into the pit. Imagine that moment. The men who had stolen his freedom were now standing before him without even recognizing who he had become. For the first time, Joseph held all the power. He could have taken revenge. He could have made them suffer. He could have reminded them of every painful memory they had tried to erase. Humanly speaking, no one would have blamed him. But God had been doing something much deeper than preparing Joseph for a throne. He had been preparing him to forgive. That's one of the greatest signs that God is working in someone's life. Not only do your circumstances change, your heart changes. Joseph finally revealed his identity. His brothers were terrified. They expected judgment. They expected punishment. Instead, they received mercy. Then Joseph spoke words that have echoed through history. "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." Think about what Joseph didn't say. He didn't say the betrayal was good. He didn't say slavery was good. He didn't say prison was good. Evil was still evil. Sin was still sin. People were still responsible for the choices they made. But Joseph understood something that changed the way he saw his entire life. God's purpose was greater than man's evil. The betrayal was real. The pain was real. The tears were real. But none of them had the final word. God did. Maybe that's exactly what you need to remember today. You may not understand why someone betrayed you. You may never know why that opportunity disappeared. You may still be carrying wounds from things that should never have happened. God doesn't ask you to pretend those things weren't painful. He asks you to trust that they are not greater than His plan. Your story is not defined by the people who hurt you. It is defined by the God who never stopped working for you. Maybe you're still in the pit. Maybe you're serving in someone else's house. Maybe you're sitting in a prison you never deserved. Or maybe you're in the long silence where nothing seems to move. Don't mistake God's silence for God's absence. Joseph couldn't see the palace from the pit. He couldn't see Pharaoh from the prison. He couldn't see the purpose through the pain. But every single step was leading somewhere, and perhaps that's exactly what's happening in your life. You feel stuck. God is positioning you. You feel forgotten. God remembers every promise He made. You feel delayed. God is working according to a perfect timing. that you cannot yet see. One day, you may look back at the chapter you wanted to erase and realize it became the chapter God used to change everything. If this message encouraged you, subscribe to Made for More and become part of a community that seeks faith, purpose, wisdom, and transformation through God's Word. And before you leave, remember this: just because your life feels stuck doesn't mean God has stopped working. Sometimes the road to your greatest purpose is built with the very stones that others threw in your path.